The evening air in California carried the easy warmth that usually made people slow down and enjoy the moment. But Andrew wasn't enjoying anything. He sat inside his black car parked across the street, staring at a house he had never seen before. 2 years. That was how long he had been away. 2 years since he walked out of a marriage that once felt unbreakable. 2 years since he boarded a flight that he told himself was necessary for business. 2 years since he convinced himself that leaving Alice behind was the right decision. Now he wasn't so sure. The neighborhood looked peaceful, the kind of quiet community people chose when they wanted stability in their lives. Neatly trimmed lawns lined the sidewalks. Children's bicycles rested near driveways. The soft orange glow of sunset stretched across the roofs of the houses. But one house stood out from the rest. The house directly in front of him. Cars were parked along both sides of the street. Music drifted from the backyard. Laughter filled the air. It sounded less like a quiet home and more like a celebration. Andrew tightened his grip on the steering wheel. This was the address the neighbor had given him only 30 minutes earlier. Alice's new home. The thought still felt strange. For years he had believed that the house they once shared together was where her life would remain. He imagined she would stay there, surrounded by memories, maybe angry, maybe hurt, maybe waiting for answers he had never given. But that house belonged to someone else now. Someone new had moved in, and Alice had moved on. Andrew slowly stepped out of the car. The cool evening breeze brushed against his face as he closed the door quietly behind him. He stood there for a moment, unsure what to do next. Part of him wondered if he should leave, just drive away. Maybe coming here had been a mistake. After everything he had done, what right did he have to appear in her life again? But the sound of laughter from the backyard kept pulling his attention forward. That sound felt familiar. Alice always loved gatherings. Back when they were married, their house rarely stayed quiet for long. Friends visited often. Someone was always telling jokes. Someone else was bringing food. Music played during weekends, while people danced without worrying about who might be watching. Alice believed life should be shared. Andrew used to admire that about her. Now it only reminded him of what he lost. He walked slowly toward the house. The front gate stood open, welcoming guests inside. From where he stood, he could see people moving through the backyard. Someone was grilling food. A group of women laughed loudly near the patio. Children ran across the grass, chasing each other in circles. It looked like the kind of gathering Alice would organize without even trying. Andrew stopped just before reaching the gate. His chest felt tight. 2 years earlier, he had walked away from Alice while she was pregnant. He hadn't returned. He hadn't checked enough. He had convinced himself that distance would make everything easier. Instead, it had only made everything emptier. A voice suddenly broke his thoughts. "Hey there." Andrew turned. A man stood a few feet away, holding a drink and smiling politely. "You looking for someone?" the man asked. Andrew hesitated before answering. "Alice." The man's smile widened instantly. "Oh, yeah. You're definitely in the right place." He gestured toward the backyard. "She's inside. Everyone's been hanging out back there most of the evening." Andrew nodded slowly. "Thanks." The man gave him a friendly pat on the shoulder before walking back toward the party. Andrew took a deep breath. Then he stepped through the gate. The backyard opened into a lively gathering filled with energy and warmth. Music played from speakers near the patio, while people talked over the steady rhythm. Plates of food sat on long tables. Someone nearby burst into laughter after hearing a joke. Andrew recognized that atmosphere immediately. Alice's influence was everywhere. He walked carefully along the edge of the yard, trying not to draw attention to himself. But the moment he reached the patio, his eyes found her. Alice. She stood near a small group of friends, speaking animatedly while holding a drink in one hand. Her smile was the same one he remembered, bright, confident, and warm enough to make people feel comfortable the moment they saw it. But something about her had changed. She carried herself differently now. There was a calm strength in the way she stood, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. For a moment, Andrew simply watched her. He remembered the first time he saw that smile years ago, at a small community fundraiser. She had been laughing so hard at someone's terrible joke that she nearly dropped a tray of cookies. That moment had changed his life. And now here he was again, standing at the edge of another gathering she had created. Only this time, He didn't belong. Just as he considered leaving again, something unexpected happened. A small child ran across the grass. The little girl looked about a year old, maybe a little older. Her curly hair bounced as she ran toward the patio with pure excitement in every step. She was giggling loudly. People stepped aside to make space for her as she moved. Then the child looked up, straight toward Alice. Her face lit up instantly. "Mama!" the little girl shouted happily. The single word seemed to freeze the entire moment. Andrew felt something inside his chest drop. Alice turned quickly at the sound. Her expression softened immediately as she bent down and lifted the little girl into her arms with effortless love. "There you are," Alice said warmly. The child wrapped her tiny arms around Alice's neck. Andrew stared. His mind tried to process what he was seeing. A child, Alice holding her, calling her mama. But something about the child's face made Andrew's heartbeat begin to race. He took a step closer without realizing it. The little girl turned her head slightly, her bright eyes scanning the crowd curiously. Andrew felt the air leave his lungs because those eyes looked familiar, too familiar. His voice came out almost as a whisper. "Alice?" Alice turned. Her gaze landed on him instantly. For a moment, the conversation around her faded into silence. She looked surprised, but not shocked, not angry either, just calm. Andrew walked closer, his heart pounding harder with every step. He glanced again at the little girl in her arms, then back at Alice, and suddenly the truth hit him, a realization so powerful it made his voice tremble. "That's my child?" he asked quietly. The yard seemed to hold its breath. Alice studied him for a moment. Then she answered with complete calm, "You didn't ask." Andrew stood frozen where he was. The sounds of the gathering slowly returned around him. Laughter, music, conversations. But none of it seemed to reach him anymore. His attention was locked on the little girl in Alice's arms. The child rested comfortably against her shoulder, completely relaxed, the way children do when they feel safe. One small hand held a piece of cookie that looked half-eaten, crumbs scattered across her fingers. Alice gently brushed a curl away from the child's forehead. The movement was simple, natural, the kind of moment that belonged to a mother and her child. Andrew felt his throat tighten. He had spent years negotiating billion-dollar contracts, speaking in front of investors, making decisions that affected thousands of employees. Yet in that moment, he couldn't find the right words to say. His voice came out uncertain. "How old is she?" Alice adjusted the child slightly on her hip before answering. "Almost 2. 2. The number struck him harder than any accusation. 2 years. The same amount of time he had been gone. Andrew slowly ran a hand over his face. The realization settled in completely now. There was no misunderstanding, no confusion. The child in Alice's arms had been growing while he built business deals overseas, while he convinced himself that leaving his marriage behind was necessary, while he chased a life that now felt strangely empty. His eyes returned to the little girl. She studied him with innocent curiosity. Children often look at strangers without judgment, simply observing the world around them. But Andrew wasn't a stranger. Not really. He just hadn't been present long enough to matter. The little girl tilted her head slightly, as if trying to decide whether he looked familiar. Then she smiled, a small, cheerful smile, and Andrew felt his chest tighten even more. Alice noticed the reaction. Her voice remained steady. "Her name is Hope." Andrew repeated the name quietly. Hope. The word felt powerful, not just a name, a message. Alice gently bounced the child once, making her laugh again. "She likes cookies," Alice added casually. That part definitely didn't come from me. For a brief second, the old humor between them appeared again. Andrew managed a weak smile, but the weight of the moment quickly returned. "I didn't know," he said softly. Alice looked directly at him. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes carried the strength of someone who had already survived the hardest chapter of her life. "You didn't ask," she repeated. The truth in those words landed with complete clarity. Andrew lowered his gaze. He had called only a few times during the months after their separation, conversations that stayed short and uncomfortable. Eventually, the distance between them grew, until silence replaced everything else. He never asked about the baby again, not once, because deep down, he didn't want to face the reality of what he had done. Now, that reality stood directly in front of him, laughing, holding a cookie. calling someone else mom. Andrew exhaled slowly. I made a mistake, he admitted. Alice didn't respond immediately. The people around them continued their evening, unaware that the quiet conversation taking place near the patio carried the weight of years. Hope suddenly reached toward a nearby table where someone had placed a plate of cupcakes. Cupcake, she announced proudly. Alice chuckled softly. You already had one. Hope considered this information carefully, then pointed again. To cupcake. Andrew couldn't stop the small laugh that escaped him. Alice glanced at him briefly. You still laugh the same way, she said. Yeah, Andrew replied quietly. Some things don't change, but most things have. He looked around the yard again. The gathering, the community, the joy surrounding Alice's life. She had built something strong during the time he had been gone, and somehow she had done it without him. Andrew finally spoke again. Can we talk? Alice studied him carefully, not with anger, not with resentment, but with the thoughtful caution of someone who had learned how to protect her peace. Later, she said gently. Then she glanced toward the group of friends, still enjoying the evening. Tonight is about family. Andrew nodded. He understood the message. He had lost his place in that world, at least for now. Hope suddenly waved her tiny hand toward him. Hi, she said brightly. Andrew's chest tightened again. He raised his hand slowly and waved back. Hi. Alice watched the interaction quietly. Then she turned and carried Hope back toward the group of friends waiting near the patio. Andrew remained where he stood. The music continued playing. Someone nearby started another round of laughter, but his mind stayed fixed on a single realization. 2 years earlier, he had walked away from his pregnant wife. He believed he was choosing freedom, success, opportunity. Instead, he had unknowingly walked away from the most important part of his life, his daughter, and that was only the beginning of the truth he was about to discover, because the story of how Alice reached this moment, holding Hope in her arms, surrounded by a thriving community, was far more powerful than Andrew could ever have imagined. And to understand how everything changed, you have to go back to the beginning. You're about to hear the story of a billionaire who abandoned his pregnant wife, only to return 2 years later and discover a secret that changed his life forever. Have you ever trusted someone so deeply that their betrayal didn't just break your heart, it rewrote your entire future? That is exactly what happened to Alice. She was left alone, pregnant, heartbroken, while the man she loved chose another woman overseas. Most people would have collapsed under that kind of pain, but Alice did something no one expected, something that shocked everyone, including the billionaire who walked away. And when Andrew finally returned to California, believing he might still recognize the life he left behind, he discovered that Alice had built something extraordinary without him. But before we continue, let me say something important. Welcome back to Mr. George Stories, where life's most powerful lessons come wrapped in unforgettable tales. If you're new to this family, thank you for joining us. Please take a moment to hit the subscribe button, because it helps us share stories like this with more people here on YouTube. Now, let's go back to the moment when everything first began, before the betrayal, before the heartbreak, before the secret that would eventually change everything. Back to California, back to a community fundraiser, back to the night a billionaire walked over to a table of cookies and met the woman who would change his life forever. 2 years earlier, long before Andrew stood outside Alice's new home, watching his daughter laugh in the backyard, Alice's life had been shaped by something far more powerful than wealth or status: community. Alice grew up in a tight-knit black neighborhood where people rarely needed invitations to visit each other. Front doors stayed open during warm afternoons. Music drifted through the streets on weekends, and neighbors treated each other like extended family. In that neighborhood, no one truly felt alone. If someone cooked a big meal, half the block showed up with plates. When someone had a rough week, 3 different neighbors arrived with encouragement, jokes, and homemade food. Alice loved that energy. She loved the sound of laughter echoing down the sidewalks on summer evenings. She loved how elders sat on porches telling stories about life lessons, while children played tag under the fading California sun. That environment shaped the person she would eventually become. Even as a child, Alice had a natural way of bringing people together. If 2 friends were arguing, she found a way to make them laugh again. If someone felt shy at a gathering, she was usually the first to pull them into the conversation. One afternoon, when she was still young, a neighbor jokingly said while watching Alice, "Talk to everyone at a cookout, girl. You act like you're running the whole block." Alice placed her hands on her hips dramatically and replied, "Well, somebody gotta make sure everybody's having a good time." The adults nearby burst into laughter. Moments like that became common. People noticed early that Alice carried a rare kind of warmth. She wasn't loud for attention or kindness for praise. She simply enjoyed seeing people smile. Weekends in her neighborhood were the best example of that spirit. Someone always brought a speaker outside. Music played while people grilled food, and children danced in the street without any embarrassment. Friends teased each other. Older relatives shared stories, and laughter traveled from one house to the next. Alice loved watching those moments unfold. To her, happiness wasn't something complicated. It lived in the little things. A shared meal, a joke that made everyone laugh at the same time, a gathering where nobody felt like a stranger. Even as she grew older, Alice carried that mindset with her. She believed life worked best when people supported each other. That belief would later influence nearly every decision she made. But at the center of Alice's outlook on life was someone who shaped her more than anyone else, her grandmother. And the words her grandmother repeated throughout Alice's childhood would eventually guide her through the most painful chapter of her life. At the center of Alice's childhood stood one person whose influence reached deeper than anyone else, her grandmother. While the neighborhood gave Alice laughter and belonging, her grandmother gave her perspective. The woman had lived long enough to understand that life rarely moves in straight lines. Joy and hardship often arrive in the same season, and the way a person responds to those moments determines the direction their future takes. Alice spent countless afternoons sitting beside her grandmother on the small porch outside their home. The two of them would watch the neighborhood move through its daily rhythm, while her grandmother shared stories about patience, kindness, and resilience. Sometimes those lessons came through quiet conversations. Other times they arrived through humor. One evening, when Alice was about 12 years old, she stormed onto the porch after arguing with a friend from school. "I'm never talking to her again," Alice announced dramatically, crossing her arms. Her grandmother looked up slowly from the glass of iced tea in her hand. "Never?" she asked calmly. Alice nodded with determination. "Never." Her grandmother took a slow sip of her drink before responding, "Well, that sounds exhausting." Alice frowned. "What do you mean?" Her grandmother leaned back in her chair and smiled. "Holding on to anger takes a lot of energy, and life already gives you enough things to carry." Alice stared at her for a moment before finally asking, "So what am I supposed to do?" Her grandmother chuckled softly. "Sometimes the best thing you can do is give people room to grow, and give yourself room to stay kind." Alice thought about that answer for a long time. Her grandmother then shared the words that would stay with Alice for the rest of her life. "Life will test your patience," she said gently, "but it will also reward your kindness." The sentence sounded simple, but her grandmother meant every word. She had seen relationships fall apart over pride. She had seen families rebuild themselves through forgiveness. She understood that life often gives people chances to grow if they remain patient enough to learn. Alice carried that message everywhere. Whenever a situation felt unfair, she remembered her grandmother's voice reminding her that kindness was never wasted. Whenever someone disappointed her, she tried to respond with understanding instead of bitterness. Her friends noticed this about her as they grew older. Alice had a rare ability to stay grounded when others became overwhelmed. It didn't mean she ignored problems. It meant she believed solutions always existed if people stayed open-hearted long enough to find them. Years later, that belief would become one of her greatest strengths, because life was preparing Alice for a challenge far bigger than a childhood argument. And the lessons her grandmother planted in her heart would eventually help her face it with courage. As Alice grew older, the lessons from her grandmother blended naturally with the lively spirit of the neighborhood that raised her. Kindness became part of her character, but humor became her signature. If a room felt tense, Alice somehow found a way to lighten it. If someone arrived at a gathering looking exhausted from a long week, She usually had a joke ready before they even sat down. Her friends often said Alice had a talent for turning ordinary moments into memories people talked about later. One Saturday evening, a group of friends gathered in a small backyard not far from the apartment Alice rented in California. Someone had brought a portable speaker, and the smell of grilled food floated through the air. Alice stood near the table helping arrange plates when one of her friends walked over, looking frustrated. "Tell me why my boss scheduled 3 meetings today just to repeat the same thing," the friend complained. Alice didn't even look up from the plates. "Because if they only scheduled 1 meeting," she said calmly, "how would they justify drinking all that expensive office coffee?" The group nearby burst into laughter. Her friend shook their head, smiling despite the frustration. "You're terrible." Alice finally looked up with a playful grin. "No, I'm helpful. Laughing is cheaper than therapy." Moments like that were common. Alice never tried to dominate attention. She simply enjoyed seeing people relax and enjoy themselves. That same warmth shaped the way she approached relationships. Alice believed love wasn't supposed to feel like a performance. It wasn't about impressing people with expensive gifts or grand speeches. Real love, in her mind, showed itself in small, everyday choices. Showing up, listening, standing beside someone when life became difficult. One evening, during another gathering, a conversation about relationships started around the table. One of her friends leaned forward curiously. "Alice, you always talk about love like it's simple," they said, "but relationships are messy. What makes you think you'll find someone who actually believes in all that?" Alice shrugged lightly while taking a sip from her drink. "Because the right person won't think it's complicated." The friend raised an eyebrow. "And if you never meet that person?" Alice smiled without hesitation. "Then at least I'll know I stayed true to what I believe." The group went quiet for a moment, not because the answer sounded dramatic, but because it sounded honest. Alice truly believed love worked best when 2 people chose to support each other through both good days and difficult ones. It was the kind of love she hoped to find one day. And in a city as large and unpredictable as California, she had no idea that the person who would soon challenge every one of those beliefs was already living just a few miles away. A man whose life looked completely different from hers. A man who had wealth, power, and influence, but who had slowly forgotten what genuine connection felt like. His name was Andrew, and the night their worlds finally crossed paths began in the most unexpected place. Before we continue, take a quick moment to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. It helps more people discover stories that remind us what truly matters. Because the story of how Alice met Andrew didn't start in a luxury restaurant or a business event. It started at a small community fundraiser, and it began with something as simple as a table full of cookies. While Alice's life had been shaped by community, laughter, and the simple rhythm of everyday connection, Andrew's world had developed in an entirely different direction. Andrew grew up surrounded by wealth. From the outside, his childhood looked like the kind most people imagined when they thought about privilege. Large homes, private schools, and vacations in places many people only saw in magazines. But his family environment carried expectations that were just as heavy as the opportunities. Success was not optional. It was assumed. Andrew's father often repeated a sentence that stayed with him throughout his life. "Money gives you freedom," he would say, "but character decides whether you deserve it." Andrew respected those words. His father had built a powerful business reputation through discipline and careful decision-making. Every conversation about the future included the same message: build something meaningful, protect your integrity, and never allow comfort to replace ambition. As a young man, Andrew embraced those lessons completely. He studied business relentlessly. While other students celebrated weekends, Andrew spent long nights reviewing financial reports, learning about investments, and studying how successful companies expanded into international markets. His professors quickly noticed the same thing his father had always seen. Andrew possessed unusual focus. He didn't chase attention, he chased results. By the time he reached his early 30s, Andrew had already begun building a reputation inside the business world. His first successful company created opportunities that led to partnerships with larger investors. Those partnerships expanded into new ventures, and before long, Andrew found himself managing projects that reached far beyond California. Success arrived quickly, Business magazines began mentioning his name in articles about rising entrepreneurs. Invitations to private networking events filled his calendar. Advisors and assistants helped coordinate the growing list of responsibilities that came with managing multiple companies. By the time Andrew reached 40, his life moved at a pace most people could barely imagine. Meetings started early in the morning. Conference calls stretched across different time zones. Flights carried him between cities where investors waited to discuss the next opportunity. From the outside, Andrew appeared to have everything people associated with achievement: luxury homes, expensive cars, influential connections. But as the years passed, his schedule slowly replaced something else: free time. The friendships he once had grew distant because he rarely saw them anymore. Conversations at social events often revolved around profit margins, acquisitions, and the newest technology companies attracting attention from investors. Andrew listened. He participated. But deep down, the conversations often felt repetitive. He was surrounded by successful people, yet genuine connection seemed harder to find. Still, Andrew continued moving forward, because in the world he grew up in, slowing down wasn't something people celebrated. And at that point in his life, Andrew believed success meant staying focused on the next opportunity waiting ahead. By the time Andrew turned 40, his professional life had reached a level most entrepreneurs spent decades chasing. His companies operated across several industries. Investors trusted his judgment, and business partners often described him as someone who understood how to recognize opportunities before others even noticed them. From the outside, everything looked impressive, but success came with a quiet cost. Andrew's daily routine rarely allowed space for anything that didn't involve work. His calendar filled weeks in advance with meetings, investor briefings, and strategy sessions. Assistants coordinated his travel, scheduled his calls, and organized the steady flow of people who needed his attention. Most mornings began before sunrise. Andrew usually started his day reviewing reports while drinking coffee at the long kitchen counter inside one of his California homes. By the time the city fully woke up, he had already answered emails, checked market updates, and prepared for the first meeting, waiting on his schedule. Days moved quickly after that. Boardrooms, presentations, negotiations, business lunches where conversations focused almost entirely on numbers and expansion plans. Even the social events he attended often felt like extensions of the same environment: elegant restaurants, private parties hosted by investors, conversations filled with discussions about new ventures and financial forecasts. Andrew understood that networking played an important role in maintaining business relationships. He listened carefully when people spoke, asked thoughtful questions, and shared ideas that strengthened partnerships. But something about those gatherings always felt incomplete. The conversations rarely moved beyond professional topics. People spoke about success constantly, yet very few talked about anything personal. Sometimes Andrew would stand near a window during these events, watching the city lights stretch across the distance while voices continued discussing the next opportunity. In those moments, he occasionally wondered whether life had quietly become predictable. Not boring, but structured. Every conversation had a purpose. Every relationship carried expectations. Every decision connected to growth, strategy, or reputation. Andrew had built exactly the kind of life his father once encouraged him to pursue. Still, something about it felt strangely quiet. One evening, after finishing a long meeting with potential investors, Andrew returned to his office to gather a few documents before heading home. As he prepared to leave, one of his colleagues stepped into the doorway holding an invitation. "You ever attend community fundraisers?" the colleague asked casually. Andrew looked up with mild curiosity. "Depends," he replied. "What kind of fundraiser?" The colleague handed him the invitation card. "Local youth program," the man explained. "Small event. Nothing fancy. But there'll be some press coverage. Good opportunity to show community involvement." Andrew glanced at the details printed on the card. The event was scheduled for the following weekend at a local community center in California. He hesitated for a moment. Charity events weren't unusual for people in his position. Supporting community programs helped organizations gain attention while also building positive public relationships. Still, Andrew usually attended larger events organized by major foundations. This one sounded smaller. His colleague noticed the hesitation. "Look," the man added with a shrug. "Even if you stay 20 minutes, it's good publicity." Andrew considered the idea briefly. 20 minutes didn't sound unreasonable. "All right," he said finally, setting the invitation on his desk. "I'll stop by." At the time, Andrew believed he was simply attending another event that would pass quickly. What he didn't know was that the decision to walk into that small community fundraiser would introduce him to someone completely different from the people he usually met. Someone whose laughter could fill a room. Someone whose outlook on life would challenge everything he thought he understood about happiness. Her name was Alice, and the moment Andrew first noticed her happened beside a table filled with homemade cookies. The following weekend, Andrew arrived at the community center exactly as planned. True to his expectation, the event was modest compared to the large charity galas he occasionally attended. The building itself wasn't extravagant, and the parking lot was filled with ordinary cars instead of luxury vehicles. But the atmosphere felt lively. Music played softly near the entrance, and people moved through the open hall carrying plates of food while greeting one another with genuine excitement. A banner near the doorway explained the purpose of the evening: raising support for youth programs in the local community. Andrew stepped inside, wearing a tailored suit that looked slightly more formal than the rest of the room. A few organizers greeted him politely, thanking him for attending, before guiding him toward the main gathering area. Conversations filled the space as volunteers moved between tables arranging food, drinks, and donation forms. Andrew checked his watch briefly. 20 minutes. That was the amount of time he expected to stay before returning to the long list of responsibilities waiting for him. He walked slowly through the room, observing the environment around him. People seemed comfortable here. There was no pressure to impress anyone. Guests laughed openly, spoke loudly, and treated the evening more like a neighborhood gathering than a formal event. Andrew wasn't used to that kind of atmosphere. His usual social events involved careful conversations, polished speeches, and people measuring every word they said. Here, the energy felt relaxed, unscripted. As Andrew approached one of the tables near the back of the hall, a burst of laughter suddenly caught his attention. Not polite laughter, real laughter. The kind that made someone lean forward slightly while trying to catch their breath. Andrew turned his head, and that was when he saw her. Alice stood beside a table filled with baked goods, holding a tray of cookies while talking with a few volunteers. Someone nearby had apparently told a terrible joke, because Alice laughed so hard she nearly dropped the tray in her hands. "Oh no," she said between laughs, trying to steady the plate. "If I drop these, the kids are going to protest." The people around her laughed again. Andrew watched the moment quietly. He wasn't staring because of appearance alone, though Alice carried herself with natural beauty. What caught his attention was the energy surrounding her. People gathered around her easily, as if her presence made the room feel warmer. Alice finally regained control of the cookie tray and looked up. That's when she noticed Andrew watching. For a brief second, their eyes met across the room. Instead of looking away awkwardly, like many people might, Alice simply raised an eyebrow with playful curiosity. Then she walked straight toward him. Andrew blinked slightly, caught off guard by the confidence. Alice stopped a few steps away and lifted the tray toward him. "You're either really interested in these cookies," she said, "or you've never seen someone laugh before." Andrew hesitated. Then he laughed. The response came naturally, surprising even him. "I think I was just deciding whether they're worth the risk," he replied. "They look dangerous." Alice tilted her head. "Dangerous?" "Yeah," Andrew said, reaching for one. "Anything that smells this good usually ruins self-control." Alice grinned. "Well, if you eat 3, we'll just call it supporting the fundraiser." Andrew took a bite of the cookie. For a moment, he simply nodded. "These are actually impressive." Alice crossed her arms with playful pride. "Of course they are." Andrew looked at her more carefully now. "You made them?" Alice shrugged casually. "Maybe." Andrew raised an eyebrow. "That sounds suspicious." Alice laughed again. "All right, fine, I helped." The two of them stood there, smiling for a moment longer than either expected. Andrew had attended countless events throughout his career. He had met politicians, executives, investors, and celebrities, but something about this conversation felt completely different. It wasn't formal. It wasn't strategic. It was simply genuine. And as Alice turned to greet another volunteer who walked over, Andrew realized something quietly surprising. The 20 minutes he planned to spend at this fundraiser had already passed, but for the first time that day, he had no interest in leaving, because the woman standing beside that cookie table was unlike anyone he had ever met before. And in that moment, Andrew understood something he hadn't expected when he walked into the building earlier that evening. This meeting wasn't just another event. It was the beginning of something that would change both of their lives. The fundraiser ended much later than Andrew originally planned. When he first arrived, he expected to stay for 20 minutes. Instead, he remained for nearly 2 hours. Most of that time passed beside the same table where Alice had been organizing the baked goods. Their conversation moved easily from one topic to another without the usual formal tone Andrew experienced during business events. At one point, Alice noticed him checking his watch. "You got somewhere important to be?" she asked with a teasing smile. Andrew looked down at the watch for a moment before sliding his hand into his pocket. "Not anymore." Alice laughed. "That sounds suspicious." "It's true," Andrew said. "I had a meeting tomorrow morning. But after tonight, I might start attending more fundraisers instead." "Oh, really?" Alice replied. "Planning to become a professional cookie critic?" Andrew raised an eyebrow. "I take that responsibility very seriously." Their conversation continued until volunteers began clearing the tables and folding chairs. Eventually, Alice wiped her hands on a small towel and looked around the room. "Well," she said, "I think we survived the evening." Andrew nodded. "And raised a lot of money for the kids." Alice smiled proudly. "That's the important part." As they walked toward the exit together, Andrew found himself hesitating before getting into his car. Normally, he would have thanked someone for the conversation and moved on, but something about Alice made the moment feel unfinished. "So," Andrew said carefully, "do you always attend events like this?" Alice leaned against the side of the building, folding her arms comfortably. "Pretty often," she answered. "Community stuff matters to me." Andrew nodded slowly. "I can tell." There was a brief pause before he spoke again. "Would you want to grab coffee sometime?" Alice studied him for a moment. Not suspicious, just thoughtful. "Coffee?" she repeated. Andrew shrugged lightly. "Or cookies. Apparently that's our thing now." Alice laughed again. "All right," she said. "Coffee works." A few days later, they met at a small cafe near the California shoreline. The place wasn't extravagant. Wooden tables sat near wide windows, where sunlight reflected off the water outside. The relaxed atmosphere felt completely different from the upscale restaurants Andrew usually visited. Alice arrived first and waved when Andrew walked through the door. "You actually showed up," she joked. Andrew pulled out the chair across from her. "You sound surprised." Alice smiled. "Some people say they'll call and disappear." Andrew leaned back slightly. "I run companies," he said. "Keeping my word is part of the job." Their coffee lasted nearly 2 hours. They talked about work, travel, childhood memories, and the strange way life sometimes connected two completely different worlds. By the time they stepped outside again, the ocean breeze carried the calm rhythm of waves across the shore. Andrew realized something unexpected. He was looking forward to the next time they would meet. After their first coffee together, Andrew and Alice began seeing each other more often. What surprised Andrew most was how natural everything felt. In his usual social circle, plans were often arranged weeks ahead. Dinners happened at restaurants where reservations required advance notice, and the atmosphere felt carefully controlled. But spending time with Alice worked differently. Sometimes she would send a simple message in the afternoon. "Are you free tonight?" Andrew would check his schedule, move one meeting if necessary, and reply, "Yes," and that was enough. One evening, they met near the California shoreline just before sunset. The beach stretched wide across the horizon, while waves rolled steadily toward the sand. Alice slipped off her shoes the moment they reached the shore. Andrew noticed and looked down at his polished dress shoes. "You're not planning to walk in those, are you?" Alice asked. Andrew glanced at the sand. "I didn't exactly prepare for this." Alice laughed and pointed toward a nearby bench. "Take them off. Nobody's judging you." Andrew hesitated briefly before removing his shoes and rolling his pant legs slightly. The cool sand felt unfamiliar under his feet. Alice started walking ahead of him, letting the water touch her toes as the waves reached the shore. "You come here often?" Andrew asked as he caught up with her. "Whenever I need to clear my head," Alice replied. The ocean is good at reminding people that life is bigger than whatever stress they're dealing with. Andrew considered that. My version of clearing my head usually involves spreadsheets, he admitted. Alice burst into laughter. That sounds incredibly relaxing. It is, Andrew replied with a small smile, if you enjoy financial projections. They continued walking along the water, while the sun slowly lowered toward the horizon. Their conversations often revealed how different their lives had been. Alice spoke about community gatherings, neighborhood cookouts, and the joy she found in helping people connect with each other. Andrew described international meetings, high-pressure negotiations, and the responsibility of managing companies that employed thousands of workers. One evening, Alice invited Andrew to join a small gathering with some friends in her neighborhood. Andrew arrived wearing a casual jacket, unsure what to expect. The moment he stepped into the backyard, music played from a speaker, while people talked and laughed around a table filled with food. Someone handed him a plate before he even introduced himself. Another person asked him if he wanted something to drink. Within minutes, Andrew realized something surprising. Nobody seemed impressed by his business achievements, and nobody seemed intimidated either. They treated him like a regular guest. At one point, someone asked him what he did for work. I run a few companies, Andrew replied simply. The person nodded casually. That sounds stressful. You want another plate? Andrew laughed. For the first time in a long while, he felt completely relaxed in a social setting. Later that night, as the music continued playing and people danced in the backyard, Andrew leaned closer to Alice. You know, he said, this is very different from the events I usually attend. Alice raised an eyebrow. Better or worse? Andrew looked around at the laughter, the conversations, and the easy energy surrounding them. Then he smiled. Honestly, he paused for a moment. Better? Alice smiled quietly, pleased but not surprised, because to her, this kind of joy had always been normal, and now Andrew was beginning to experience it too. As much as Andrew enjoyed stepping into Alice's world of relaxed gatherings and community warmth, he also wanted her to experience the side of life he had built through years of hard work. One evening, he invited her to dinner at one of the coastal restaurants he occasionally visited after long business meetings. When Alice arrived, she paused just inside the entrance and looked around the dining room. Soft lighting reflected off polished tables, and the large windows revealed the ocean stretching across the horizon. Alice leaned slightly closer to Andrew and whispered, I feel like I should apologize to someone for wearing normal clothes. Andrew chuckled. You look perfectly fine. Alice raised an eyebrow. That's easy for you to say. You probably own this place. I don't, Andrew replied with a small smile. At least, not yet. They sat near the window, where the evening sky slowly faded into deeper shades of blue. For Andrew, restaurants like this had become routine over the years, but watching Alice experience the environment with curiosity made the evening feel different. She studied the menu for a moment before looking up. Tell me the truth, she said quietly. What? Do people really eat food this small on purpose? Andrew laughed. You're not impressed? I'm impressed, Alice replied. I'm just wondering if we're supposed to stop somewhere for real food afterward. Their laughter carried easily across the table, drawing a few amused glances from nearby diners. Moments like that became part of their rhythm. Andrew introduced Alice to elegant places she had never visited before. Alice introduced Andrew to the simple joys he had slowly forgotten. One weekend morning, Andrew invited Alice to his house for breakfast. She arrived expecting something simple. Instead, she found Andrew standing in the kitchen, holding a spatula with the serious focus of someone performing a complicated experiment. Alice folded her arms and leaned against the doorway. What exactly is happening here? She asked. Andrew glanced over his shoulder. Breakfast. Alice looked at the frying pan. A pancake sat in the center, slightly uneven in shape. You sure about that? She said. Andrew ignored the comment and carefully slid the spatula under the pancake. I've watched this done many times, he said confidently. Alice raised an eyebrow. That doesn't sound promising. Andrew flipped the pancake. For a brief second, it rose into the air perfectly. Then it landed on the floor. Alice stared at the pancake. Andrew stared at the pancake. A moment of silence passed before Alice burst into uncontrollable laughter. She held the counter to steady herself. Oh my goodness, she said between laughs. You manage companies worth millions, and you just lost a fight with breakfast. Andrew looked down at the pancake and sighed. In my defense, he replied calmly. The floor moved. Alice laughed even harder. Andrew couldn't help smiling. The kitchen filled with the kind of laughter that made small moments unforgettable. Eventually, Alice walked over and picked up the spatula. Move over, she said. Let a professional handle this. Andrew stepped aside. Within minutes, she flipped a perfect pancake onto the plate. Andrew crossed his arms. I feel like I've been replaced. Alice slid the plate toward him. No, she said playfully. You've been promoted to taste tester. Andrew took a bite and nodded. Now that's impressive. Alice grinned. See? Real talent. Moments like that strengthened the connection between them. Their worlds were different, but instead of creating distance, those differences gave them something to learn from each other. And as weeks turned into months, Andrew realized something important. The time he spent with Alice wasn't just enjoyable. It felt meaningful. For the first time in years, his life included something that had nothing to do with business or ambition. It was simply about two people discovering how naturally they fit together, and neither of them realized yet how deeply their lives were about to change. By the time Andrew and Alice had been seeing each other for nearly 2 years, their relationship had grown into something steady and deeply meaningful. They had learned each other's habits. Alice knew Andrew woke up early, even on weekends, because years of business discipline made it difficult for him to sleep late. Andrew knew Alice could turn almost any situation into a moment of laughter, especially when someone nearby took themselves too seriously. Their differences had stopped feeling like contrasts. Instead, they became balance. Andrew still worked long hours managing his companies, but now he found himself making space in his schedule for things he had once ignored. Community events, quiet dinners, simple walks along the California coast. One evening near the end of summer, Andrew invited Alice to meet him at one of the beaches they had visited many times before. When Alice arrived, the sky glowed with the warm colors of sunset. The waves moved gently toward the shore, creating the calm rhythm she always loved. Andrew stood near the water waiting. Alice walked toward him with a curious smile. You called this an emergency meeting, she said. Should I be worried? Andrew shook his head. No emergencies. Good, Alice replied, because I almost brought a helmet. Andrew laughed quietly, then gestured toward the water. Walk with me? They began moving slowly along the shoreline. For a few minutes, they simply enjoyed the sound of the ocean and the cool breeze drifting across the sand. Finally, Andrew stopped. Alice turned toward him. You're being unusually serious, she said. What's going on? Andrew looked down at the sand for a moment before meeting her eyes again. I've spent most of my life building businesses, he began. Every decision I made was about growth, strategy, and the next opportunity. Alice listened quietly. Andrew continued, but somewhere along the way, I forgot to build something just as important. Alice tilted her head slightly. What's that? Andrew smiled softly. A life? Alice's expression softened. You've got one now. Andrew reached into his jacket pocket. That's exactly why I asked you here. Alice noticed the small box in his hand and immediately froze. Andrew opened it slowly, revealing a simple but elegant ring. I didn't want a huge event, he said gently. Just a moment that belongs to us. Alice covered her mouth, surprised. Andrew took a slow breath. The best decision I ever made was walking over to that table of cookies. Alice laughed quietly through the emotion rising in her chest. You only came for 20 minutes, she reminded him. Andrew nodded. Best 20 minutes of my life. Then he asked the question that changed everything. Alice, will you marry me? For a moment, the only sound around them was the steady rhythm of the ocean. Alice looked at Andrew, then at the ring, then back at him again. Her eyes filled with happy disbelief. Yes, she said. Andrew smiled with relief and slid the ring onto her finger. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, the two of them stood together on the shoreline, knowing their lives had just taken a new direction, and the celebration that followed would bring both of their worlds together in a way neither of them had ever experienced before. Planning the wedding turned into an experience neither Alice nor Andrew expected. Their lives had always moved in different circles, and preparing for the ceremony made that difference more visible than ever. Andrew's professional connections began offering suggestions almost immediately. Luxury venues, formal guest lists, carefully arranged seating plans. Meanwhile, Alice approached the entire process with a completely different energy. One evening, they sat at the dining table, reviewing possible plans, when Alice gently pushed one of the expensive venue brochures aside. "Andrew," she said, "this place looks beautiful, but it also looks like nobody would be allowed to laugh." Andrew raised an eyebrow. "That's not exactly the goal." Alice smiled. "I want people dancing. I want people talking loud. I want my family bringing food even if we already hired a caterer." Andrew leaned back in his chair. "So you're saying this wedding might get lively?" Alice laughed. "Might?" After a moment of thought, Andrew nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's do it your way." In the end, their wedding became something unique. The ceremony took place outdoors along the California coastline, where the ocean stretched endlessly behind the small gathering of chairs arranged for the guests. Andrew's business partners arrived wearing polished suits and expensive watches. Alice's family and friends arrived with laughter that carried across the sand before the ceremony even began. Music played softly as guests found their seats. When Alice finally walked toward Andrew, the sunlight reflected gently off the water behind them. Andrew watched her approach with a quiet smile. For someone who had built his life on careful planning, that moment felt beautifully simple. When the time came to exchange vows, Andrew spoke first. "I spent years thinking success meant building companies," he said. "But meeting you taught me that success also means building a life filled with the right people." Alice smiled warmly. Then it was her turn. "I always believed love should feel real," she said. "Not perfect, but strong enough to stand through anything life brings." Their words were not long, but they were sincere. When the ceremony ended and Andrew kissed Alice, cheers erupted from both sides of the gathering. The celebration that followed felt exactly the way Alice had hoped. Music filled the evening air. People moved between tables sharing food, stories, and laughter. Andrew's business associates looked slightly surprised at first by the relaxed atmosphere, but before long many of them joined the conversations and enjoyed the warmth of the gathering. The entire evening felt like two very different worlds meeting with respect. For Alice, it was the perfect reflection of the life she wanted to build. For Andrew, it was something even more meaningful. It was the moment he realized how much joy existed outside the boardrooms he had spent most of his life inside. And as the music continued playing beneath the California night sky, the celebration grew even more lively than anyone expected. As the evening continued, the wedding celebration transformed into exactly the kind of gathering Alice had imagined from the beginning. Music flowed across the outdoor space as guests filled the dance floor. Some people moved with confident rhythm, while others danced with enthusiastic determination that didn't always match the beat, but nobody seemed concerned about perfection. The atmosphere felt relaxed and joyful. Tables overflowed with food brought by family members who insisted that no celebration should ever depend on a single caterer. Guests moved freely between conversations, greeting one another like longtime friends, even when they had only just met that evening. Andrew stood near the edge of the dance floor watching the energy unfold around him. One of his business partners stepped beside him, adjusting his tie slightly, while observing the lively scene. "I've attended a lot of weddings," the man admitted, "but I've never seen one quite like this." Andrew smiled. "That's because you've never met Alice." The music shifted to a faster rhythm, and the crowd responded immediately with cheers. Someone shouted from across the dance floor, "All right, it's time." Andrew looked toward the voice, just as a small circle began forming in the center of the crowd. Alice's family members clapped their hands, encouraging two people to step forward. One of them pointed directly at Andrew. "Come on, Andrew," the voice called out. "Let's see what you got." Andrew laughed nervously. "Oh no," he said quietly. "I think they're serious." Alice appeared beside him with a mischievous smile. "You're the groom," she said. "That means you don't get to hide." Andrew raised both hands in surrender. "I feel like I'm walking into a trap." Alice leaned closer. "Relax," she said playfully. "Just move your feet and try not to embarrass yourself too much." Andrew stepped into the circle, while the crowd clapped in anticipation. The music grew louder, For a moment, Andrew simply stood there, unsure how to begin. Then, he attempted a few dance moves he remembered from previous parties. The crowd responded with encouraging laughter. Someone shouted, "Okay, Andrew," but the real reaction came when Alice stepped into the circle beside him. Her movements were confident and full of energy, drawing cheers from everyone watching. Andrew shook his head in amused defeat. "I'm clearly outmatched," he admitted. Alice laughed while continuing to dance. "That's because you spend too much time in meetings." Andrew tried again, spinning once before nearly losing his balance. The crowd erupted with laughter and applause. Even Andrew couldn't stop smiling. For a man who usually approached life with careful control, the moment felt completely free. Eventually, the music slowed, and the crowd dispersed back into dancing and conversation. Andrew walked back toward the tables beside Alice. "That was unfair," he said. "You had home field advantage." Alice grinned. "You did fine." Andrew looked around at the celebration still unfolding across the evening sky. Friends talking, family laughing, music continuing to carry across the warm California night. Then he looked back at Alice. "I've spent years attending events filled with successful people," he said quietly, "but I've never been this happy." Alice studied his expression carefully before answering. "That's because tonight isn't about success." Andrew nodded. "It's about love." Alice smiled. "Exactly." As the celebration continued, the two of them stood together watching the joy around them. Neither of them knew yet how much their lives would change in the coming months. But in that moment, surrounded by laughter and music, the future looked full of promise. Before we move forward with the next chapter of their story, take a moment to share something in the comments. Do you believe love can truly bring two completely different worlds together? Stories like Alice and Andrew's remind us that sometimes the most unexpected connections become the strongest, and their journey was only just beginning. Marriage did not suddenly transform Andrew and Alice into different people. Instead, it strengthened the rhythm they had already built together. Their home in California became a place where two very different lifestyles continued blending in natural ways. Andrew's work still required discipline and long hours. His companies operated across several cities, and many of his days remained filled with meetings, strategy sessions, and travel planning. But something about his routine had changed. Before Alice entered his life, Andrew often treated his schedule as the center of everything. Now he made space within that schedule for moments that mattered outside of business. Morning coffee together before he left for work. Late dinners when his meetings ran long. Weekend walks along the beach when both of them needed time away from responsibilities. Their home slowly filled with signs of shared life. Books Alice placed near the living room couch. Documents Andrew reviewed at the dining table. Music playing in the kitchen while Alice experimented with new recipes. One Saturday morning, Alice stood at the counter stirring pancake batter, while Andrew walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one beside her. "Peace offering," he said. Alice looked down at the coffee, then at him. "For what?" Andrew leaned against the counter. "For the pancake incident a few months ago." Alice laughed immediately. "You mean the moment you invented floor pancakes?" Andrew sighed. "I was hoping we could retire that story." "Not a chance," Alice replied, pouring batter onto the pan. "That story is part of history now." Andrew shook his head with a smile. Their home often filled with the same kind of energy that had defined Alice's childhood. Friends visited for small gatherings. Music occasionally played during weekends. Neighbors stopped by for quick conversations that sometimes lasted much longer than expected. Andrew adjusted to that atmosphere surprisingly well. At first, his business colleagues seemed curious about the changes in his routine. One afternoon during a meeting, a partner noticed Andrew checking his phone. "Everything all right?" the partner asked. Andrew glanced down at the message and smiled. "Yeah," he replied. The message came from Alice. It simply read, "Don't forget dinner tonight, and don't bring spreadsheets." Andrew placed the phone back on the table. For the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to the end of a workday, because home no longer felt like just another place to rest. It felt like a place where life actually happened, and although neither of them realized it yet, that life was about to grow in a way that would change everything. A few weeks after that quiet stretch of newly married life began settling into routine, Alice started noticing small changes in her body. At first, she didn't think much about it. She felt more tired than usual during the mornings. Certain foods that she normally enjoyed suddenly didn't seem appealing, and other cravings appeared without warning. One afternoon, while preparing lunch, she opened the refrigerator and stared at the shelves with mild confusion. Andrew walked into the kitchen just as she closed the door again. "What are we having?" he asked. Alice leaned against the counter. "I have no idea." Andrew frowned slightly. "That's unusual." Alice laughed. "Very funny." But later that evening, she thought about it more carefully. The changes were subtle, yet something about them felt different enough to raise a quiet question in her mind. A few days later, she decided to schedule a routine appointment with her doctor. The clinic sat in a calm part of the city, where large windows allowed natural light to fill the waiting area. Alice checked in at the front desk and soon found herself sitting in one of the comfortable chairs, flipping through a magazine while waiting for her name to be called. Her thoughts drifted between curiosity and cautious excitement. She didn't want to assume anything too quickly, but the possibility quietly lingered in the back of her mind. When the nurse finally called her name, Alice followed down a short hallway into the examination room. The doctor greeted her warmly and reviewed a few routine questions before suggesting a quick test just to confirm what might be happening. Alice nodded. "Let's check." The process didn't take long, but the minutes that followed felt slower as Alice waited for the results. She sat quietly on the edge of the chair, her hands resting together while her thoughts wandered. She imagined Andrew's reaction if the news turned out to be what she suspected. He would probably freeze for a moment. Then his mind would immediately begin thinking about responsibility, plans, schedules, future preparations. That was Andrew's nature. A few minutes later, the doctor returned. The warm smile on the doctor's face answered the question before a single word was spoken. "Well," the doctor said gently. "Congratulations." Alice blinked. "Congratulations?" The doctor nodded. "You're pregnant." For a moment, Alice simply sat there, absorbing the words. Pregnant. The meaning of the moment slowly spread through her thoughts, like sunlight filling a room. A small